I'm excited to share the story with everybody. Are you excited too?
Very much so.
Well, I think I'm first on the list to read,
Yep.
so we'll go ahead and get it going. I've been a small town cop for 12 years. There's one case that still scares me. Being a cop in a small town in Minnesota probably isn't the most exciting career there is, but it's not bad either. It's actually a relatively peaceful and safe line of work compared to being in law enforcement in one of the big cities, New York or LA, for example, where all the action is, as they would say. There's only around 10,000 people in the town where I live. It's way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of open farmland, and the only real crime that ever occurs is pretty minor stuff. The occasional rowdy rednecks getting into fistfights, teenagers vandalizing, petty theft, the odd drunk driver here and then, a case of disorderly conduct here and there, a rare breaking and entering, and then a couple of times I've been to some more serious stuff I've had to deal with, like domestic violence, assault, and then robbery. But that's not even that typical. It doesn't really happen that often. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one case that still haunts me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I was saying, I live in a peaceful little town, boring some would even say, the kind of rural, out-of-the-way farming community you've probably driven through on the highway on your way to somewhere more interesting, without even really thinking about it as you pass it by. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens, you've probably thought. And for the most part, you'd be right thinking that. But there's one case I can't get out of my mind. One case that still makes my blood run cold whenever I think about it. One case I can't explain no matter how hard I try to rationalize it to myself. What happened to the old Garrity woman 7 years ago? I'd been a police officer for 5 years when it happened in the early spring of 2014. There were only 5 cops on the entire police force. Me, my partner Jerry, Pete and Vance, who both worked the night patrol, and the police chief. Plus Karen, an older woman who is a retired librarian and worked part-time as the dispatcher. The police department was located in the town building. It consisted of 2 offices, one for the chief, then an open work area for the rest of us. There are 3 jail cells in the rear, and the 3 of them were never all occupied at the same time. It was an overcast, rainy afternoon in late March, early April. Me and Jerry were in our cruiser on a routine patrol around town when Karen's voice came over the radio telling us there was a possible 1082 in progress at the Garrity house on Turner Road. We acknowledged, then changed directions heading to the Garrity house. I wasn't overly concerned about the call. I already had a pretty good idea who made it. Aline Garrity was an elderly woman who was a widow who lived in a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She was probably around 65 or 70 years old and had lived alone since her husband had died of a stroke 3 years before. They had 2 children, but both of them lived out of town and never visited her. Since her husband's death, she had developed something of a reputation of being crazy. Okay, I guess that's not putting it so nice. She was a shut-in who rarely left her home and had groceries delivered once a week. Basically a crazy cat lady, minus the cats. The reason she was considered crazy was because she had become pretty flaky and paranoid since being widowed and had called the police department on multiple occasions for everything from hearing intruders moving around in her attic to seeing UFOs in the cornfield. There were probably at least a dozen other calls too. All her calls turned out to be false alarms, of course. The robbers she claimed were hiding in her attic turned out to be a pair of raccoons that had slipped in under the roof, and the UFOs were probably just jets flying overhead from the National Guard base 50 miles west. Me, Jerry, Pete, and Vance had all visited her home multiple times before, during our respective shifts. We never got frustrated with her or gave her a hard time about it, and usually we would inspect her house and property to calm her nerves. She'd relax, thank us, we'd leave, and the process would repeat itself in a couple weeks or maybe a couple months. Honestly, our infrequent trips to her house were probably the only real highlight of what was a rather dull and unexciting job. When we told the chief about Mrs. Garrity's latest emergency, Bigfoot was sneaking around in her yard, or there was a giant anaconda lurking in her basement, he would just shake his head sadly. When Vance and Pete were the ones who had to deal with her, they'd tell us all about the most recent ordeal when me and Jerry saw them at Shift Exchange. They'd usually smirk in a mean-spirited way, and Pete would twirl his finger next to his temple before they left, symbolizing that she's crazy. Jerry and I just felt sorry for the old woman. It couldn't have been easy for her, a frail, nervous, lonely woman living all alone in that old, crumbling house with no friends or close family. I suspect she might be getting senile or maybe entering the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. We worried about her living out there by herself, almost a mile from the nearest neighbor. If her health suddenly turned bad or she had an accident, couldn't call for help, well, there wasn't really much we could do about it. A couple of times I looked at the numbers of her daughter and son and tried calling them about possibly placing her in an assisted living home or a mental health facility. But the one time I actually managed to reach her son, as I was explaining his mother's situation to him, he interrupted me, telling me he was too busy at the moment and would call me back, then abruptly ended the call. He never did call me back. From then on, they always happened to be unavailable and never answered any of the voicemails I left them.
It's such a sad, turn of events for someone later in life to, start to lose their faculties, and then, their family isn't even around to, help them or at least calm them down. And it's all up to these small town police that she keeps calling to try to make something of it,
First of all, the introduction is the hardest read of the whole thing. It's the longest and hardest. But just going back to the community and the area, it really feels like the place that we're from, this small town. I think he worded it as you'd pass by on your way to go somewhere more interesting.
Yeah.
That sounds like a lot of the rural area that, we live in. So I could kind of relate to that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's a little bit smaller, this story, but I could kind of relate to what he was saying though.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of, like you said, the towns that we lived in, and some of the areas, there was only one cop in one of the towns we lived in,
Yeah.
And so it was just, if you lived in those areas, the feeling of how these people react, the way that there usually is someone kind of by themselves that probably...
You probably know everybody too, right? It's a small place, you know everybody, you know their story.
Oh, yeah. You'll know most of the people in the town if it's small enough. We've been in towns that were 600 people, and, you knew almost everyone.
Yeah. So it seems like this is that kind of place. So the old lady Garrity keeps calling them, and there's a couple different patrols, right? There's him and Jerry. Him and Jerry are the day shift. The Pete and Vance are the night shift, I believe.
Yeah.
And it kind of sounds like they both approach this lady differently.
Yeah.
They on the day shift are a little bit more kind, and the night shift are a little bit more, I don't know, mean, joking about it. But it seems like he really relates to this lady. Not even really relates to her. He really feels for her, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, he understands that she's not all there and she can't help it, and he just feels bad about it. He's even tried calling the family members.
How did you feel about those family members not even just blowing her off?
It's a really, like I said, it's a sad state of affairs. It's just how could you let that happen? You have your mother by herself, and if that's going on, you got to step up.
Obviously, if you're just now tuning in, she's widowed. Her husband passed away, they say 3 years ago at least. So she's trying to manage and take care of herself, take care of this old farmhouse. And they think possibly developing dementia or some sorts. She frequently calls the cops for false alarms. They're very used to it. Even gave some examples of thought intruders were in her house. It was raccoons in the attic, UFO, Bigfoot. So it makes you wonder, is she calling to get, I don't want to say attention, but...
It's probably not intentional, but if your mind's starting to go and you're by yourself, you might call just to have some sort of interaction with another person. But beyond that, she probably does think she sees these things, and she's scared because she's by herself.
A mile away from the closest neighbor.
So it's clear that, she just gets worried and scared out there by herself, and she will need someone to be there for her.
Did a great job, I think, setting the stage here for the first part of the story. We know kind of that was a quick, good description of, the situation. Then, of course, you're going to jump back into it with the events that follow.
Jeff Townsend Media. CG, good night.
And the question is, do I stay here? Will you be back? Are you gonna come back? Will you be back? Are you coming back?